The main setting of these novels often involves a quaint little bookshop, a cozy small town cafe, or a library. The protagonist is usually a lonely soul, often a fairly young person, seemingly bogged down by the constraints of life and carrying some kind of emotional or psychological trauma from the past. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and this is Rati here, and I'm talking about the immensely popular genre of healing fiction novels. And in this video, I'm going to delve deep into the dynamics of the healing fiction novels, what actually constitutes the genre, and what are the main themes, and what explains the immense popularity of the healing fiction genre. Now, generally speaking, healing fiction genre refers to the wave of Korean and Japanese novels that have gotten quite popular over the past couple of years and have been translated into English. So these novels follow a typical formula. I mean, of course, the storylines are different from from one book to the other, but there's a fairly typical formula that lies at the center of these healing fiction novels. There will be a protagonist who is usually a young person, and they will often encounter some kind of they will either come into contact with some kind of wise figure. It can be human being, somebody elderly, or it can be even it can even include supernatural elements, like somebody from the animal kingdom, like for example the whole phenomenon of cats talking to humans, and the protagonist will carry some kind of, like I said, emotional and psychological trauma, but through some kind of divine magic intervention, or some kind of fantasy element, some chance happening, or something like that, the trauma gets resolved. So the setting of these novels is very, very much familiar, a typical urban setting, and the characters you would come across in healing fiction novels are mostly the people you would meet in everyday life. There's nothing sort of unrealistic about the settings or the characters, but it's a treatment which is unrealistic. And like I said, the sort of literary device of magic realism is frequently used in healing fiction novels. Now, nothing much happens by way of plot in these novels. The storylines are relatively simple and it's not much complex. In some of these novels, the protagonist, might be pretty much in the same place physically by the end of the novel as they were in the beginning. But there's a lot of mental growth, that happens, a lot of psychological characterization of the protagonist. And by the time we reach the end of the novel, the protagonist, would have evolved. So it's kind of a Bildungsroman as well. And, they would have sort of negotiated with, whatever problems, whatever psychological problems, loneliness, existentialist angst, whatever it is that they were dealing with. So this is roughly the structure of healing fiction novels. Now, coming to the main themes of the healing fiction novels, what are the predominant themes of healing fiction novels? I would say that, cultural burnout is the predominant theme of these novels. Basically, since most of these novels are located in an urban setting, kind of a small town setting, where the where the protagonist is, it's kind of burdened with some kind of existentialist angst, some kind of existentialist dislocation, psychological dislocation brought on, by the mechanized existence that we all are leading today in an urban environment. We are constantly bombarded with so much of stimuli, and there's so much of consumerism all around us, this breakdown of community structures, which is giving rise to the problem of loneliness. And we are constantly bombarded by social media, surrounded by social media, there's too much of overwhelming stimuli all around us, but still we are lonely, and this is the typical feature of city life, where, like I said, the community structures have broken down. So this is the kind of psychological angst, existentialist angst, whatever you might choose to call it, that healing fiction novels predominantly seek to explore. So the protagonist, can be somebody who's a perfectionist, and it's usually a young person. Like I said, they might be very good with their jobs, but they still feel, a sense of dislocation and a lack of completeness. Maybe they're completely depressed with their life for reasons, that are not apparent to them, because they are good with their work and they might be very successful or whatever, but still this is kind of loneliness. So cultural burnout due to urban existence, I would say, is the predominant theme of healing fiction novels. And some kind of psychological trauma the protagonists are carrying, and Like I said, due to some kind of fantastic intervention, something magical happens, and the protagonists, kind of evolve, and the process of healing begins. For example, in Before the Coffee Gets Cold series, which is a very famous healing fiction novel series by a Japanese author, this concept of a time traveling cafe. So there's a time traveling cafe where you sit on a particular chair and you can go back in time. So you can literally, sort of apologize to people you might have done wrong to in the past. You can even meet dead people and, sort of like gently untangle the knots of your consciousness, apologize for them if you had done anything wrong in the past, or, sort of discuss contentious issues with them, which you couldn't have then. So the rule is that, you cannot, of course, undo what has happened in the past. If somebody has died, they're died. But you can unburden your consciousness. At least you can do that. And, the only condition is that you have to drink the coffee, before it gets cold, because once the coffee gets cold, then you get stuck in the past. You have to come back to the present before the coffee gets cold, because otherwise you stay stuck in this past. So a time traveling cafe becomes a metaphor for sort of different people psychologically unburden themselves and coming to terms with the problems in their life, with psychological issues related to loneliness, mental health that they face. And the setting is very, very much urban, like I said. Similarly, in this book called The Cat Who Saved Books by a Japanese author, again, there is this very supernatural, fantastic element where there's a young boy and he lives with his grandfather, and his grandfather runs a bookstore selling rare books, but his grandfather passes away, and all of a sudden this young boy is completely burdened with things he knows nothing about. He's supposed to run the bookshop, even though he loves books, but he's kind of at a crossroads and he's intimidated and clueless about what lies next. Then a cat appears from nowhere and literally takes him on a magical expedition where he sort of kind of his own love for books is reaffirmed, and he kind of goes through a labyrinth saving books. And by the time he sort of comes back, he's a much sorted person and he knows what he wants from life. So there's this like I said, there's this formula of some kind of divine or magical kind of intervention happening which fixes the life of protagonists. Then in some healing fiction novels, you also see this trend of sort of the finer things of life, be it books, literature, or art, becoming a symbol for healing. So in a lot of these healing fiction books, you would see that books literally play the main character, and a lot of these novels are set in sort of libraries or bookstores. So you have this kind of thing that the protagonists are usually very fond of books, and they cannot relate to the world around them, but they have this sensitive soul which is nurtured by books. So books are literally, like I said, the co-protagonist in many of these novels. For example, in More Days at the Morikasi Bookshop series, which is again written by a Japanese author, the protagonist is this young Japanese girl who lives with her uncle and auntie, and they're running a bookshop, and she is a slightly curious soul in the sense that she cannot really relate to people her age who are into partying and those kind of loud things, but she is very fond of books, and she's kind of like, she has this different kind of very introverted personality, and she enjoys talking about books, but she's kind of she takes everything inside, and she's not very extroverted, so to say. So she finds refuge in books, and you see throughout the novel her love for books really determines her life choices and the kind of friendships she makes, and even her love interests are focused on her love for books, so her romantic interests, that is. So it's interesting, like I said, how a lot of these novels, in a lot of these healing fiction novels, books or literature emerges as a symbol for healing. Similarly, art, like there is this Korean book about pottery. It's titled The Healing Season of Pottery. So in this, there's this young protagonist again, who left her job, and despite everything was going well, she felt completely burnt out and left her job, and she's depressed, doesn't get out of her room. Then a chance sort of by chance she enters a pottery workshop, and then there's no looking back. She not only becomes a pro at pottery, she starts taking pottery lessons, but it literally sort of makes her come face to face with her own sort of like ghosts from the past, and it leads to a process where her psychological wounds are healed, and some questions from the past, some issues from the past achieve closure, and she also sort of meets the love of her life, the potential love of her life. So it's very interesting, like I said, how sort of the finer things of life, be it books or literature, art, they become a healing force in a lot of healing fiction novels, in a lot of healing fiction literature. Now, are healing fiction novels repetitive and cliched? This is a common sort of acquisition hurled at healing fiction novels, and I would say to a large extent it is true. Some of these novels can actually be cliched and repetitive. And if you've read a couple of healing fiction novels, like after reading 5-6 books, it can get a bit irritating and you might just get bored because, the storyline is all similar. Like I said, there's this formula of young protagonist who is, usually sort of bogged down by life and, something divine or magical happens, or, there's usually, some kind of elderly wisdom figure which is there in these novels. So, I would say that, there can be a certain element of sort of, boredom and some kind of repetitiveness, and they can appear cliched and repetitive at times. Especially I would say that this tendency to serialize healing fiction novels, part 1, part 2, part 3, and they go on and on. This is a little bit, I think that makes these novels redundant. I would say in some of these novels, part 1 would suffice, or maybe part 1 and part 2, because the rest of the parts of the series are, fairly repetitive. It's just my opinion. Having said that, this is a fairly new genre and it is still developing, and I obviously haven't read all healing fiction novels, so the genre will also evolve with time. So I suppose we will come across different elements and more interesting storylines. But as of now, I think this central formula which healing fiction novels to employ is a bit of a cliche. Now, are these novels shallow? There I would disagree. These novels are certainly not shallow, even though they are not really they cannot be classified in the category of very serious literature, very intense kind of, that serious typical highbrow literature, like for example, writings of Dostoevsky or Milan Kundera or Sylvia Plath's autobiography Beljar. But still, they deal with very complex issues, issues related to loneliness, existentialist issues and mental health issues, basically. So, I would not say that they are shallow. The approach might be gentler and they're more suited to general readership, a first-time readership. They are not as complex in terms of, their whole sort of makeup and structure, but that doesn't make them shallow. I would say that they deal with sort of some very contentious and complex issues and some of the things which people don't even talk about, and some of these novels have this melancholic tinge about them, and even though there is this feel-good factor about them, that doesn't mean that they don't deal with, in fact they deal with very, very serious psychological traumas. And for example, in Before the Coffee Gets Cold series, when people come to the time traveling cafe and they sit in that chair, there's this constant thing about people meeting dead people, which can be very unsettling and unnerving, and there's in a lot of healing fiction novels, there's a lot of death and disease happening, but it's just a way of dealing with these problems, which is sort of more wise, and that's where the healing fiction novels, become different from sort of the typical literary genre in which, the problems are kind of, the complexities just go on and on, whereas in healing fiction novels, there's a certain kind of, optimism, associated with things, and, a certain kind of wisdom is projected in how to deal with difficult situations. So I would not say that healing fiction novels are shallow. I don't agree with that. Now, what are the writing styles, what are the literary devices used by healing fiction novels? I think since, they are primarily translations into English, the writing style, I would say, is fairly, simple, and they're very accessible to first-time readers. Of course, the original structure of Japanese and Korean languages is completely different. That's why you see in translations, there's a lot of symbolism which the translations try to capture, which is very, interesting. So the whole writing style, I would say, it's very fresh and breezy and old world. Like it has this, fairy tale, like fable, like old world, kind of charm and wisdom about it. The writing style of healing fiction novels, it's like reading, an urban fairy tale, a modern day fable. You get that kind of a feel while reading these novels. Coming to the literary devices, like I said, magic realism is prominently used in these novels, the tropes of fantasy. And even, when in those novels, where nothing is happening, magical is happening directly, like in the Morikasi bookshop series, there will be some kind of, some sequence of events or some chance meeting, some chance encounter, that will change the course of a person's life. So they're very dramatic in that sense. And I would say there's a lot of intuitive symbolism deployed in these novels. So even if the element of magic realism doesn't come across directly, there is this something happening, and a sequence of events that, sets the chain running. So there is some kind of intuitive symbolism, which is deployed in these novels, which I think it's a feature very peculiar to sort of, to literature which is not originally written in English. I might be generalizing, but I think it's a very, you see this kind of feature in a lot of Indian writing as well, this kind of intuitive symbolism. Now, coming to the final part, why are these novels immensely popular? I would just say, that the kind of world we are living in right now, these novels sort of, make a lot of sense, and they give us, some sense of location in this very fragmented and dislocation universe. We are constantly surrounded by wars, geopolitical conflicts, then this whole social media overload, and we're surrounded by a lot of a lot of negativity, a lot of sort of macabre stuff which is happening in real life. It's just too much for us to handle. So I think now we are hankering, for something simpler. I think the dystopia is already right there in front of our eyes. So we don't need, those novels which are sort of kind of fantasizing about a dystopia or trying to be clever. We need something, which gets us out of the dystopia. So I think, according to the times we live in, healing fiction novels cater to our hankering for simplicity, our hankering for return back to sort of basic structures of life, basic human sensitivity, human emotions, then a return to community structures, human empathy. These are very basic qualities which are traditionally not considered literature worthy, because literature is traditionally considered very complex. But I think, the kind of world we are living in, sort of healing fiction, we need such kind of, literature. We need to read such kind of literature where, there is sort of there's not a tendency to make things more complicated, but, there is a celebration of simplicity, something which I also find in Ruskin Bond's writings. And Ruskin Bond, I think, can also be his new work especially can come into the category of healing fiction. Anyhow, that's a different topic for discussion altogether. But yeah, I do think that healing fiction novels are immensely popular because of the kind of times we are living in. They're very contextual. And I think, this genre, like I said, is going to develop more because it's fairly new, and we're going to see a lot of exciting work in this genre. And that, like I said, they are very suitable for beginner readers. So guys, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the content, please do press the like button, and please do subscribe to the channel. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.